Stanford University.
Thank you, Frank, for the kind introduction. I've followed in Frank's footsteps for many, many years, apparently with the hair reference similarly in that vein as well. So it is great to be back here at Stanford. I thought, not that my background's all that interesting, but I'll spend a minute just on my background and sort of how I've come to my place in life. I did have the pleasure of studying here at Stanford and under Frank and working on my honors thesis, in fact, with Frank. It's really nice to be back here after spending my undergraduate years here and then spending a couple of years at Goldman Sachs. I got a bit confused, ended up at the Stanford of the East Coast and spent a couple of years at business school there and have since been in New York and today lead, as Frank mentioned, our energy and infrastructure business. And as we go through this, I'll talk a bit more about sort of what that means and really what we do. But the root of my job today is to find places where we can deploy capital for long periods of time, earn, we hope, attractive risk-adjusted rates of return. We do that largely on behalf of retired pensioners, state pension funds, so teachers and policemen and firemen are largely the people we work for today. And my particular part of that job is to find places in the energy and infrastructure complex where we can make those kinds of investments. Now, for us, investing is a long-term business, and we look around the world for ways we can invest. Now, we look at investment through a lot of different lenses, and I'll talk a bit about the way the world's changing and where that brings us. We think there's a lot of different ways to invest in energy and infrastructure, and again, I'll cover in this conversation a bit about those different ways and some of the angles and ideas that we see. And as Frank mentioned, how that might tie to future opportunities, whether those are investment opportunities or job opportunities. I'll try to touch a bit on how one might translate your interest in this area into a career as well. So the global energy dynamics, I think today is a really, really interesting time in the energy space. And that reflects in these three circles, from our point of view, a few really interesting kind of changing forces. Probably the most important one is the long-term demand for energy resources around the world is growing. So when we as long-term investors say, where do we want to deploy capital? It's appealing to us to find places where there are tailwinds, places where the world's changing, if you will, in our favor or the wind is at our back. And energy happens to be one of those areas. It is a truism that when economies grow, they consume more energy. Now, there are different ways to produce that energy, and I'll talk about some of the different ways one might produce energy today and in the future. But it is a near certainty, certainly mathematically speaking in the past, that as you grow an economy, you have to consume more energy to drive it. So the long-term demand picture is an extremely interesting one, and from our point of view, my point of view, a really interesting one. Now, supply is changing rapidly too. That is to say, the sources of energy around the world are changing radically. And I'll focus a lot on this shift today and what's driving that shift. But a lot of it is the advent of unconventional resources. That is to say, shale gas and shale oil, probably the most significant development in the energy landscape, at least in the last several decades. And I'll talk a bit about what that may mean for the outlook for different forms of energy. However, that change, that shift, that availability, abundant availability, at least today in North America, of shale gas has had a kind of an interesting effect, which is actually, of course, has depressed the price of natural gas, depressed the price of energy. Well, that's good for an economy. Of course, as I said, economies grow, they consume energy, so a cheap input is a good thing in some respects. It obviously has other implications in terms of alternative sources. Renewable resources are actually very much susceptible to this sort of pricing pressure coming from abundant natural gas resources. It's also coming at a time when the economy is slow. So at the very same moment that supply of energy resources from shales has risen, demand has declined, or at least has failed to grow in any substantial way. That truism about the growth in demand for energy works the other way as well. When economies contract, of course, the demand for energy contracts. So we're at a time when supply and demand in the short term are actually working sort of the opposite direction. That is to say, supply is rising, demand is decreasing. So we're actually seeing that translate into a reduction in the price for natural resources. That's all happening at a time when the long-term picture remains a very robust one. So for a long-term investor, this is actually a pretty interesting time. This is actually a time of great disruption in the energy markets with a very bright long-term future for the demand for that resource. So we find this to be a quite compelling time to invest, whether it's human capital or financial capital, in the energy landscape. So this is just to put a few numbers to this point about energy demand, and I think we all know this, but the bottom line is energy demand has been growing significantly. It will continue to grow, largely driven by growth in non-OECD countries, largely driven by consumption in China and India. We all know some of these sort of statistics. Today, there are more cars sold in China than there are in the United States, and they're at the front edge of their consumption of a product like cars. So the demand for energy is clearly going to grow. In this particular estimate, a couple billion tons new energy required just over the next decade or so. That's a lot of energy. That's a lot of energy we have to find. It's a lot of energy we have to produce. And it's a lot of energy we have to transport from where it is today to where it's going to be consumed in the future. And this too, again, we all know intuitively, which is the energy is largely not located where it's being used. So the bulk of the world's energy is in the Middle East, but very little of its consumption. Whereas if you look at the kind of right and left of this chart, Asia and the US, where we have sort of the bulk of the consumption, we have very little of the actual product. So as we continue to sort of support particularly growth in Asia Pacific, we have to rebuild the infrastructure in the world to support this type of new energy demand. Energy historically was produced in one place, basically shipped to North America and consumed. That's the way the global infrastructure is equipped today. That's the way the pipeline networks are set up. It's the way the tanker networks are set up. It's the way the port facilities are set up. And that's changing. So the investment is not just in producing electricity or producing oil and gas. It's also about how we move that around the world or within a given location, how we get it from where it can be produced to where it's going to be consumed. That's a particularly acute challenge when we talk about renewables. How we get it from where we can produce it, where there's lots of space and lots of wind and sun, to places where it's consumed is a pretty daunting challenge. And I'll spend some time on that in the presentation. This is just another cut at the question of what it takes to actually drive that type of infrastructure development. So there are a lot of different estimates, but the short answer is to invest in infrastructure the world needs to support economic development requires $1 to $3 trillion a year. That's a lot of money that we have to invest over the course of many, many, many years in order to drive the kind of infrastructure requirements needed. So I mentioned before this issue of unconventional resources, which is shale gas, shale oil. It is probably the most significant development in energy, as I said, of the last several decades. Arguably here in North America, probably the most significant development really since the inception of the oil and gas industry. Now, that has a lot of implications, good and bad, and again, we'll talk about that. I'll spend some time on it. I'm sure there'll be questions on it. But I think that it is not unfair to say that the sort of disruptive effects of the advent of unconventional resources are really to the energy industry what things like the iPhone and the Kindle have been to other sort of traditional industry bases. That is to say the disruptive effects, say the energy change, the unconventional resource phenomena, is probably the equivalent of the internet to energy. And in fact, it's really happening at just about the same speed. If you take a step back and just look over the last 5 years, in 2008, we reached an all-time high in natural gas and oil prices here in North America. The prevailing wisdom at that time was we were basically out of conventional resources. And that's when gas was at $13 an MCF, oil was at $150, $146. Today, gas is below $3 an MCF. Oil has risen back again, but still is at $100 a barrel, $110 versus $150. So the disruptive effect, and this is all since 2008. So what we've seen is it actually is very much like technology. In fact, it really is technology. When we talk about unconventional resources, we've always known the shales are there. We've always known that the oil and gas existed in the rocks. The issue is we didn't have the technology to extract it. So in many regards, this really is a technology revolution as much as it is an energy revolution. So when we look today, and many in the room are probably engineers, so I apologize for those for whom this is obvious, but just a moment on some of the terminology and sort of what I mean when I say unconventional resources, because it will be a central theme as we go forward in the discussion. So yesterday, if you will, was this traditional find a place where you think there's oil and gas and you drill a well, and you go down until you can find a pocket of oil and gas that's been accumulated, obviously, over the many millennia. So that's this sort of conventional gas up here in the upper right-hand corner. Down below there was what was considered sort of the kitchen, the place where a lot of that oil and gas was cooked over the years and ultimately percolated up until it hit an impermeable place, a seal, and that's where that oil and gas accumulated. So the history was going and looking for those pockets that had naturally developed. The technology development in horizontal drilling, or unconventional resources, was really the ability to go down to that source rock. So instead of waiting for the food to get served in the kitchen, to go down to the kitchen itself and basically drill into that rock and extract the resource. That's really what unconventional resources are about. And at the end of the day, that has changed the supply picture for natural gas here in the United States from one where the sort of prevailing view was we had maybe 2 decades of natural gas resources available to today, 100 to 200 years and probably more as we develop the technology further. And that's all happened since 2008. So before I get into some of the kind of direct implications of oil and gas, let me comment a little bit about what this has meant for renewables, a topic of great interest to many of us. Let me talk a bit about the impact on renewables from this advent of shale gas and shale resources. So this is a whole lot of numbers, and I'll turn it into a graphic in a minute, but this is basically just looking at the levelized cost of producing a megawatt hour of power from the different forms of resources on this chart. So this is cutting it, and these are all the different assumptions. This is from CIRA. I'll turn it into a graphic for the sake of this discussion. This is sort of the levelized cost of producing a megawatt hour of power. So when we look here from the far left, these are gas power plants, all the way to the right, which is solar photovoltaic. And the challenge is kind of apparent, I think, which this is assuming $5 gas. Today, gas is $3. So you'd actually have to adjust this power price from $75 to probably about $50 in terms of the cost to actually pay all your expenses and earn a return on capital. The solar bar would be unchanged by the change in cost of gas today. So today we'd be looking at about $50 cost to generate a megawatt with gas versus $225 to generate a megawatt with solar PV. Now that doesn't make solar PV bad and it doesn't make gas good, but this is the economic challenge of getting from the left-hand side of this chart to the right-hand side of this chart. That bar is probably not going up a lot. Now gas prices will levelize over time. They'll find an equilibrium. That's how markets work. But let's even just go back to this $5 example. Then you'd have $75 versus $225. So a lot of investment in technology is going to have to occur, and a lot of innovation that right now is not obvious to bring that curve down to the left-hand side of this chart. So this is sort of the other side, if you will, of the shale gas revolution, which is the good and the bad news, depending on your perspective. The good news is it means an abundant source of relatively cost-effective energy. But it also means that we're going to have a lot of challenges for the development of alternative forms of energy. And it isn't for lack of investment in those alternative forms today. There's a lot of capital being invested. We've invested in this area, and I'll talk a bit about the conditions under which people like ourselves can put capital into the area of renewables. But this is the challenge to keep in mind as we think about what the shale revolution has sort of meant for the power landscape. So what might one do in terms of investment in the changing energy world? And I'm going to spend some time getting a little more into details of the impacts of each of these major forces that I think may be interesting certainly from an investment point of view, could be interesting from a career point of view, and I think hopefully at least lend some architecture to how to think about what's happening in the energy world. So we start at the top with some observations about the industry, about the energy industry. So it is, of course, an asset-intensive, capital-intensive business. No question about that, and that doesn't really matter where on that chart you are. The fact of the matter is this is an area that requires a tremendous amount of capital investment. From a point of view of someone like us, that's appealing. This is a place where what we supply is usually in large demand. Disruptive technologies are reinventing the sector. So as I said, just in the last few years, really the entire paradigm for energy resources has changed. So that kind of disruption tends to create a lot of change, a lot of opportunity, and that, of course, again, is interesting to people with a long-term view of investment in this area. It's driving a lot of complexity. There's a lot of unknowns today. How will these resources develop? How will we ultimately find the balance between environmental impact and sort of abundance or availability and cost? And given all those unknowns, there's going to be winners and losers. And that, too, is a way of investing one's human or financial capital and obviously trying to make a choice in terms of what path things will follow. The macro factors, these are kind of this transition from where we were to where we're going, and all that capital it takes puts a lot of pressure on companies today, whether they're startups doing clean tech or the biggest of oil and gas companies. This is a very challenging transition to make. And it's going to put a lot of pressure on their access to capital. And yet, at the same time, back to the early slide, the long-term demand picture is a very appealing one, both from a participant in the industry point of view or an investor or someone who's choosing to work in the area. So some of the themes that, for us, emerge from that observation, sort of that pyramid of forces. So number one, global commodities are increasingly valuable. Now, that statement goes well beyond energy, to state the obvious. The demand in growing economies for natural resources is driving this shift, not just in energy. We're seeing the same thing in metals. We're seeing the same thing in coal, and the race around the world to find those inputs to drive one's economy. And it is both an economic and really kind of a security and strategic question for just about everybody involved. Technology advancements are enabling brand new sources. So technology is a very key undercurrent of everything we're going to talk about today, which is how can we use technology to more effectively harness the resources that are available to us. Supply developments are generating a need for new infrastructure. I commented on that before. Growth in low-cost supply for certain commodities, so that was gas. Recall that change from $13 an MCF to $3, is displacing or changing certainly a lot of other resource choices that are made. So for example, coal today is not terribly competitive given the cost of gas. So what we're seeing right now, given low-cost gas, is a lot of displacement of coal power generation by gas-fired generation. So that actually is a pretty interesting change. Net, hard to argue that's not a favorable change. That actually, gas production has about half the carbon emissions of coal, has none of the particulate and mercury. So it is certainly a favorable change. And depending on obviously one's perspective on the externalities, you can debate whether it's an optimal change or not. Environmental concerns are significant. They're increasing, and they are going to require sort of best practices from industry, and they're going to require more effective regulation. And quite frankly, both sides need to get together in this discussion and come up with ways to talk about the development of these resources in an optimal way, balancing environmental impact with the economic need, the resource requirement. And last, volatility is sort of the term of the day. I think it's going to stay that way. That is to say, the ups and downs in commodities are likely to stay persistent for some time as these markets find equilibrium. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about a time of disruption and change. Markets are trying to find their way back to balance. That's going to take some time, given the shifts in supply and demand I commented on earlier. So let me take a few of the subcomponents that we talked about, a few of the subcomponents of the energy industry, and just dive a little more deeply into some of the observations that may be interesting, certainly some of what goes through our heads as we think about how to approach these sectors. So first, let's just talk about oil and gas, the upstream production center for these resources. So unconventional and deep water developments have been game changers. As I commented before, I talked a lot about unconventional. Deep water has been a very significant change and also a significant impact. The opportunity for extraction, for getting reserves from places that we knew they were there before and never could get them before, as I mentioned, that's probably the most significant change. Very favorable long-term potential in things like oil. So there's a reason for capital to go here. People can make a very attractive return on capital when oil is $90 a barrel or $100 a barrel. Weak natural gas, on the other hand, is putting a lot of pressure on companies. So weak natural gas prices today, which is a lot of the historic production here in North America, is actually really suppressing the profitability of most domestic operators. You know, we often see the numbers around the big international oil companies, the super majors, if you will. Of course, most of what those companies do are develop oil resources either in the deep water or, quite frankly, in foreign locations, non-U.S. jurisdictions, and they're incredibly profitable when oil is $100 a barrel. But most domestic producers, most independent oil and gas companies, the bulk of what they produce is natural gas. They've really been the pioneers, the entrepreneurs behind the development of unconventional gas resources. But the consequence of their success, the consequence of their effectiveness, has been they're actually earning very little money today, and they're yet trying to invest in what they think is this 10, 20, 50-year future. So that is going to lead, depending on how it's ultimately financed, to a lot of growth in the production of gas. In turn, the availability will presumably lead to new centers of demand, and I'll comment a bit on that as we go forward. So the unconventional assets themselves you read a lot about. They attract a lot of attention. That is the big places, the Barnett Shale being the earliest one, the Eagleford Shale, the Marcellus Shale. Some are probably very familiar to all of you. Some may not be familiar terms, but these are vast new resources that have been discovered in the last few years. And they draw a lot of capital. Conventional resources, so that old model of looking around for those pockets of oil and gas, pretty out of favor today, not really where the capital is flowing, although it is where the majority of oil and gas we consume in North America still comes from. So the place where we get a lot of our energy is really not very much in favor. The place where we probably will get a lot of our energy, very much in favor. So that creates some interesting opportunities, both investing in terms of that long-term development potential of the unconventional resources, but also, quite frankly, funding the continued production of that historic base that oil and gas that really is still the engine, I guess pun intended, of our economy today. And the maturity of some of these plays is basically leading to a different kind of capital. It's not growth capital. This is really about, if you will, very mature assets that can be monetized over time. So that's a bit of what's happening in the sort of upstream space, the oil and gas space. I might talk for a minute about power and utilities. And some of this, we started with a discussion of that set of bars where we looked at the levelized cost of power. But what's happening in power, as I mentioned, is this abundant growth in natural gas is really fundamentally changing the supply picture in power. The same thing we thought about oil and gas, and of course these statements are connected, applies to power if we look back to 2007 and 2008. We were seeing all-time record power prices, and that reflected the cost of these underlying commodities. The underlying commodity prices have changed dramatically, and so therefore has the production cost of power. So at a time back in 07, 08, costs of megawatt hour power, take that chart, reverse it again, and you actually had to have power well into the $150 range to make natural gas-fired production economic. But we're in a different place today. And so the gap has now opened up between natural gas-fired power and other forms of generation, renewables being the most acutely challenged in that context. Deregulation of these markets has yielded that result. That is, power is now in many places a competitive market, some places successfully, some quite unsuccessfully, as implemented originally here in California. Depends if you design your market right. But where markets have been designed and let operate, we've seen what happens, which is competition occurs and prices tend to come down. Demand growth in power is low in the US. It's growing probably 1% a year. So it's making for relatively long cycles in the power industry. It makes a bit of sense. We're in a pretty mature economy. Back to that linkage between energy and economic growth. If the economy accelerates, so will the demand for power. But we've actually become more efficient about the way we use power. That's good news, no matter how you look at it. And so the growth for power is not the same as the growth in the economy in general. There's a lot of unknowns today in the power world. The EPA obviously has a number of pending regulations that have impacts on different parts of the power sector. Obviously, post-Fukushima in Japan, a lot of uncertainties about nuclear power and how that will develop in terms of a next wave of power resources. And technology advances are changing here too. So the development of things like solar and wind have been a great advance, but they're a very modest part of the supply picture today. So if you take all forms of renewable other than hydropower, today that's about 3.5% of the power generation in the US. So it's a growing, a very high growth part of the sector of the economy and the power stack, but it's a very small part of the power stack today. And so we'll continue to see a lot of growth in renewables, but it's going to be a long road ahead in order for them to really be displacing a substantial part of the power picture as it's currently configured. And with low-cost gas, that picture's probably, or that runway is probably that much longer. Resources. So this is moving a little bit away from energy just for a moment to talk about other resources. As I mentioned, obviously, this growth in non-OECD countries, these developing economy models, are demanding not just inputs of energy, but inputs of all forms of raw materials. So the quest to find the metals that are needed, the copper and the iron ores of the world, has led to an equally important set of activities and capital requirements. A lot of that has been outside of the US. Most of it's been outside of North America. Canada has a bit more of that than the US. But actually, a lot of this resource development is not quite as front and center for many of us here in North America. A lot more of this is happening in places like South America, Australia, and Africa. But an equally interesting set of opportunities. When we think again about whether it's capital or one's careers, this is another one of those mega trends. The reality is that the need for these materials, there are not good substitutes. When we talk about power, we even had a stack of different ways we could produce power. When we think about the use, for example, of copper, there are not many good substitutes. There are not many things that are equally conductive and useful as copper or don't corrode like other metals do. And so copper is very, very hard to substitute for. So you could even make the argument that it's a scarcer commodity and probably a more interesting one to develop from an investment or kind of company or business and career point of view. The growth in demand is not likely to change unless you think the growth in the economies in the developing markets is going to change. Again, I think one goes hand in hand with the other. If you conclude that emerging market growth is going to continue, you probably conclude that the growth in the need for resources is going to continue as well. And coal is state of flux itself, kind of a market unto itself as well. You know, we live in a world that's kind of bifurcated in the land of coal. So coal in the US is in a state of decline. Coal in the US is not the source of future growth. That's largely because of the cost of natural gas being low So natural gas, as I mentioned, is displacing coal. It also relates to the costs of coal, the externalities, and therefore the costs imposed on operating coal-fired facilities. Elsewhere in the world, they're not on the same track. So if we look at China today, they build a new coal plant about every 2 weeks. India can't get enough coal. Today in many parts of India, including urbanized areas, you have power shortages in the summer. These are not the small rolling brownouts or blackouts that we've experienced in our lives. This is 6 and 8 hours at a time without power on a consistent basis. So we talk about in power things like reserve margins, the amount of excess capacity that you have available to fulfill demand, because power can't be stored, so you have to produce it at the moment you're using it. In India, you essentially have negative reserve margins, right? That is, there is inadequate capacity, even close to fulfill the peak demand capacity. So their demand for coal is really essentially endless today. And so you see a lot of actions being taken by Chinese businesses or governments and Indian governments and businesses to secure those resources to power their economies. And this is leading to a lot of activity around the world in M&A and a lot of investment in these resources. So with that as a bit of the landscape, I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about some of the career implications of this discussion. And this is just a few categories that I kind of throw up there to think about. So this is a lot of change. This is a lot of new businesses that are going to be started. It's a lot of existing businesses that are going to go through a state of great transition. And that creates a lot of opportunity. So general management, people have to run all these businesses. That is a tough job. I'm not qualified to do it. A lot of the people in the investment business by no measure are qualified to do it. We find people that are. We like to back those people. So our business, much like venture capital is to startups, is to a lot of existing operating enterprises that are going through transition, which is providing the capital and the operating support to back people that have the insight and have the general management capabilities. So management in the energy industry, the resource industry, is really in a renaissance. And that is a big change. If you think about over the last couple of decades, we've really been in a state of decline of all these businesses. Very few people really going into kind of petroleum engineering, very few people going into the mining and metals and oil and gas business here in the US. And that has changed quite a lot. In fact, it's changed globally. It's likely to change more. A lot of what I've talked about today has been North America-centric, largely because so far, unconventional resource development has been a North America-centric development. But it won't stay that way. These shales, these same rocks, exist around the world. It's a matter of time before we understand the technology well enough to apply it in different places. So this is really a global opportunity set from a career point of view. And in fact, the ability to help advance and take technology elsewhere in the world may be one of the greater skill sets one could deliver. Engineering, and I guess we're in the right building for that, clearly central to what we've discussed today. Every element of this conversation has really been about the technology to access resources. And that's really been an engineering challenge. That's really what all of these developments have been about. And a lot of them are driven by engineers who have the insight into how to advance the technology in a way that ultimately creates economic outcomes. So startups, I mean, obviously not a job per se, but an interesting opportunity set. So the way to bridge the gap in that early chart when we talk about, for example, renewables to conventional or unconventional resources has got to be about bringing the cost of renewables and alternative technologies down. And that's going to come probably from Silicon Valley. There's been a lot of money invested, a lot of time invested, and certainly some big accomplishments, but a long ways to go. One of the challenges in the energy complex is it is so capital intensive. I made that comment earlier. And that's one of the challenges that clean tech startups face, which different from the internet where scalability came down to adding a server or 2 or 3. When we talk about a brand new way to provide liquid fuels, we're often talking about $1 billion investment to produce a pilot plant. That's a very different kind of scale of capital, a very different kind of risk and reward. And so this is a fascinating area, but an area that today really needs a lot more good thinking and innovation and will also require a lot more capital. But I think it is a place where capital will flow. The good news is the prize is huge. If you think about the share of our economy that's spent today on consuming traditional fuels, that's a lot of money that can be saved if people can crack the code on some of these new technologies. So startups are a really interesting place, and obviously you're in the epicenter of it. Finance, where a lot of capital is needed, a lot of financial activity will be required. A lot of people will be required to help get the capital from where it exists. Some of that is pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, and get it to the startups or get it to the existing companies that have the vision for where they're going to go to develop energy resources in the future. And investing too. So I guess last ending with where I spend my time. So this is taking that capital and trying to figure out where to deploy it, trying to figure out what companies we want to invest in, what companies we want to own, and what outcomes we're trying to achieve. At the end of the day, we ultimately are measured on our ability to deliver a return adjusted for risk, and we think there's a lot of that opportunity available in energy, and we need a lot of great people in this business to figure out how to do that capital allocation. So let me end on something that's been a big part of our practice, and I think probably is important. I think about the theme of this lecture, which is really about doing good and doing well. So I think a lot of common wisdom is that business and profitability are sometimes at odds with environmental impact. And that's just not true. We've been able to find ways, and in fact have a pretty proactive effort in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund, to find ways to align incentives. That is to say, to find ways where we can lessen impact on the environment, improve our environmental footprint, while improving profitability. So if we can find ways to improve the bottom line of a company while lessening its impact on the environment, it's a clear win. And that is also a repeatable one. So part of the origin of this partnership between EDF and KKR has been about repeatability. How can we use the companies we have as incubators for some of these best practices, and then promulgate those best practices to other businesses? And it's been a real great success for us, for the environment, for EDF, and it's really been about really getting to measurable outcomes. Our business is about generating tangible results and measuring them and managing them. So for us, this started back in 2008 with a few of our companies. As we roll forward, we've added more and more companies to the portfolio. This is something we look at every time we think about a new business. We look at ways where we can implement this program, look at ways where we can improve the environmental performance of a company while driving bottom line performance. So what that's led to so far, it's led to a reduction of 810,000 metric tons of CO2, 2.2 million tons of waste removed from the system, 300 million liters water less used, and from the point of view of the businesses, $365 million in savings. So it's a win on both sides of this equation. So business profitability and environmental performance are not at odds. In fact, I think it's in our collective interest always to try to find those ways to align those interests and deliver those results. So this has been a part of our efforts to sort of find ways to do well and do good at the same time. And I think that's out there. So I think when we talk about careers, we talk about the investment horizon, there are ways to bring these forces together and have, if you will, both benefits. Have an economic result and also one that helps deliver for the community and society at large. So these are some of the other partnerships we've developed when we think about outside of just environmental impact. We talk about impacts on the communities and constituents that surround businesses. We were early adopters of the principles for responsible investment. Work closely with other groups that are trying to bring others to the fold to think about, if you will, holistically, when we invest in a business, what are the things we can do to make that a better company, which is going to be measured in profitability, but it's going to be measured in other ways too. It's going to be measured in stakeholder impact. And that's been a big quest of ours, and I think it's going to be a focus and an opportunity for those that are either in the general management arena, in startups, or in the investment business or finance, is to help drive that sort of common goal. So with that, I think I'll wrap up the prepared remarks, and we'll shift into Q&A.
Yes, I'm in charge of questions, so any questions? Oh my goodness. Yep.
Hey Mark, thanks for the speech. With the ensuing expiration of the PTC at the end of 2012, are you guys looking at picking up any development assets on the wind side, maybe taking a little bit longer approach to developing them?
Yeah, I think, so the PTC being the production tax credit, which is the credit that's provided to generators of renewable resources for each hour of power they generate. So yes, we do take a long view of the opportunity to invest in wind and solar. We've been very active in trying to talk to developers about, in many cases, their existing projects are probably a better fit for our capital than the more developmentally oriented projects, but the two go hand in hand. We've made 2 investments this past year, for example, in Europe, where we bought existing producing wind farms in one case and solar farms in another, and that freed up the capital for the developers to continue with their activities even in the presence of sort of lessened government subsidies. So I think our role, given, and this is for KKR specifically, not for the investment community broadly, our focus has tended to be on more developed businesses, ones that have existing operating assets, So the way we've been able to support developers is by helping invest and sort of free capital up from some of their existing production so they can continue to develop their pipelines even in the face of uncertainty around tax credits or frankly other forms of finance.
So I know the focus of this talk about energy, but in terms of other commodities, I guess, do you have an opinion on fresh water and investment opportunities there, whether in distribution systems or desalination technology, for example?
It's a great question and a really fascinating topic. So probably the only scarcer resource in the world today than a lot of these commodities, in fact, is water. And a lot of the production of these commodities consumes a lot of water, so these are not de-linked at all. In fact, probably the most objective impact, and obviously one that's going to have to be managed pretty carefully, of the development of unconventional resources is the demand on water resources to develop them. So we have looked a lot at water. So water is a very interesting resource. The resource itself is not easy to invest in. So it's not so easy to actually buy water, although here in the West of the United States, of course, you can buy water rights. But it's not a very large-scale business by and large. Politically, a very challenging business. But it is actually a really interesting one in the manner you just described, which is desalination. And that technology has come a long ways. Desalination is, in fact, a very efficient way to deliver water in a lot of parts of the world. We're incredibly blessed here with the water resources in total we have in North America. You know, take yourself and transport to other parts of the world, the water resource scarcity is considerably more acute. The cost solution, desalination, actually works quite well. And water utilities as well. So you talked about the distribution infrastructure. That fits in that earlier category I talked about, that $1 to $3 trillion a year of capital. So water systems in this country were largely built 50, 75 years ago, and they leak a tremendous amount of water into the ground. So today, the impact on the environment, and frankly, as a cost matter, the loss from the existing systems is pretty high. So taking the capital, which we are interested in doing, and investing it to rebuild those networks, very interesting area, big opportunity. That's going to be in the sort of lower end of risk and reward. Those are going to tend to be regulated utilities or pipelines. And then when you get into things like development of desalination, really interesting high growth market opportunities. The water resource itself, some people have invested. There's an article a couple of years ago about, I think, T. Boone Pickens having bought up water rights, but I'm not really sure how that all will play out in the future. I think that's a much trickier area to invest in.
Not a student, but anyway, so in terms of like Powder River Basin coal, as demand in the U.S. declines, which I think almost certainly it will, do you see that they will really make a big effort to sort of try to make up the slack and buy, they have the capacity to produce enormous amounts of coal and it's fairly high quality. Do you see really the export market growing very substantially in that regard?
So it's a very interesting topic. And I'd start with this observation that today, if you look at the Powder River Basin coal producers, actually most of the rents available in that business are extracted by the railroads. Right? The production of coal in the Powder River Basin is not a particularly profitable business. So the real choke point, if you will, today, the place where the rents, the economic rents are being taken are really by the railroads. So in many regards, that question is more ultimately going to be about the railroads than it is about the coal producers. Indeed, if the coal producers could cost efficiently get their product from there to a coast where it can be exported, they would do it. I mean, that is, the demand for thermal coal in the world is quite high, although it's expensive to ship. But the demand is high. Today, you could not economically make it work because the cost of transporting the coal from the Powder River Basin to a coast is so high. If you then add on top of that the cost of putting it on a ship and taking it to India or taking it to China, it's really an uneconomic proposition. So the question would really come down to one of how the railroads ultimately decide to act, more so than how the Powder River Basin producers decide to act, I think.
So do you have any insight on the railroads?
Well, they're very profitable businesses. They've managed to obviously develop these incredibly powerful networks that are pretty hard to replace. So I think the railroads today are managing their business in a pretty profitable fashion. And again, I think you can see that because the coal producers are getting very little, but the end user of coal pays a pretty high price today. And all the difference is in the railroad. So I think the railroads are pretty good businesses. You saw Warren Buffett buy one of them. He doesn't tend to buy lousy businesses. So I think it probably suggests they've got a pretty good thing going.
You mentioned that in the long term, you expect strong demand and costly weak supply, but in the short term, the picture is reversed. Do you have any idea, or did you make any scenarios or prediction when that change will happen?
So I certainly wish I had the crystal ball to know when the economy will turn. look, it probably is turning as we sit here today and you look at macroeconomic statistics, and for the experts on this, it's very dangerous for me to comment on this subject, but by all measures, we are seeing the economy grow again. So we're probably already in the early reversal of that demand picture. Supply is strong and it's probably going to stay strong, but it's starting to reverse. I mean, markets do work. So what's happened over the course of just this past 6 months? With the decline in gas prices down to $3 an MCF, we've seen rigs, those drilling rigs that are doing all that unconventional drilling, move away from gas development into oil development. So lo and behold, when oil's $100 and gas is $3, people reallocate their capital. So I think gas rigs are now down 36% in just the last 5 months. So we're seeing supply response today, which is people saying it's just uneconomic for me to produce in a $3 world. It's highly economic for me to go look for oil in a $100 world. So they're reallocating their capital. So I think we're starting to already see the if you will, equilibration of these things. Demand is picking up, and I hope it'll continue to accelerate, and I hope the economy will continue to accelerate. And we are starting to see supply try to find equilibrium. It's contracting. It's sort of oversupplied the market effectively, and it's no longer economic to produce for most people today. So I think we'll probably see those lines start to cross. I can't give you an exact time frame, but it's already underway.
Let's get a student there.
So how economical is the transport of natural gas from international markets compared to, say, oil or coal, which you can easily put on a supertanker and transport?
So LNG, the liquefied natural gas, which is the only way you can transport gas globally today, is itself a pretty interesting technology and a pretty interesting area for development globally. So again, let's just think about the change over the last few years and address that question then as shale has emerged on the scene. So if we look back to the mid-2000s, the development of LNG was about liquefaction, the liquefying of this gas, largely in the Middle East, so in places like Qatar, that were building huge facilities to liquefy gas, and the plan was to ship it to the US. So regas facilities are the places where we take that liquid gas and turn it back into gaseous form and ship it around. That was where all the capital went. So there was billions and billions and billions of dollars of capital invested in regas facilities, the ports where this gas would come. Well, those regas facilities today are basically worthless in light of the change in the shale development here in the US. So again, we just think about how radically the world has changed in this period of time. Those facilities were meant to import gas are now basically worthless. No one would want to ship gas here to the US when it's $3 or quite frankly $5. Today it's $9 or $10 in Europe, it's $15 in Japan. So anyone that puts it on a tanker and ships it, they're generally not shipping it here. So what's happened now is you have these regas facilities here in the US. People saying, well, I've got this facility, what can I do with it? And they're talking about now turning them into liquefaction facilities. So they're talking about the US now becoming an exporter of natural gas. I mean, it really is almost the unimaginable even 3 years ago. And actually one of the early adopters of this, Cheniere Energy, just announced over the last couple of months that they have a permit to now reverse their facility. Now it's going to cost another $5 billion to take their facility or so and turn it into an export facility from an import facility. But if you have gas that's $3 or $5 an MCF here and is $10 or $15 elsewhere, there's plenty of economic return to develop that capacity to export that gas. So depending on your economic model, the cost of liquefying and delivering gas is probably a couple dollars an MCF. So there's, if you will, ample opportunity to develop resources here or elsewhere and ship them around the world. Someday we'll probably bring global markets into balance. Just about every other commodity we know of is globalized. Gas is not. Gas today is still a very regionalized market because that infrastructure doesn't exist.
Thanks for your talk. I wonder if I could follow up on the gas question. We've just seen some of your peers in the industry finance the Cheniere facility. You've got probably 10 North American facilities kind of lined up behind that. On the supply side out of North America, at the same time, potentially oil indexation in Asia weakening, a lot of supply coming out of Australia in the next 5 years. To folks in your industry, what's your view on plowing more capital into export facilities out of the U.S., given the price dynamics, 5 years out in Asia and the kind of volatility risk that we may see?
Well, you're right on all the forces you described. They're at play. And I think that the result is when you look at what most of the participants in the gas business here or the LNG export prospects, they're mostly looking to develop contracts with counterparties in largely Asian markets. So you're right, that risk, when you're thinking about a capital investment that's going to take 20 years to amortize, Not easy to do on spec, right? Not easy to say, well, I think this price relationship between oil and gas is going to hold. I think the right amount of capacity gets built, so the markets are actually equilibrated as opposed to what's happened now, right? We've got an oversupply. Same thing could happen to LNG. So I think when you look, most of the developers are trying to establish long-term either index contracts or even firm contracts that would support the development of capital. So it's actually in some regards, in kind of a funny way, a bit more like Suntap than it is like East. That is to say, it's a bit more about ultimately the underlying contracts than it is really a view of the economics of the capital itself or the end market 15 years from now for gas.
Do you have any thoughts on energy efficiency investments? Is that something that you guys are looking at?
Yeah, so of course the most effective way to, the most economic way to ultimately power the economy today is to use less. I mean, that is, we've all seen this famous chart. Actually, it's one of those rare places where there's actually a negative cost to some of the early displacement, right? If you just turn off the lights, you actually save energy and it saves you money. And this isn't a hard thing to do, right? Simple things like insulation and things one can do for energy efficiency in one's own home or in buildings. So it's a really interesting area. People have yet to really crack the code on how to turn that into sort of an investable market other than in relatively small fashion. So today it tends to be a very kind of small shop entrepreneurial business. I think there's every reason to think it'll become a big business. So, one was thinking entrepreneurially, thinking about startups. I think that's a really interesting area where actually scale, it may work. You don't have the same capital intensity to implement. Now there's questions about barriers to entry if you go around saying, hey, I can make your home more energy efficient. But nonetheless, I think it is a really interesting addressable market. I think you have seen people start to try to develop the regulatory framework, which is today you get paid if you're a utility or you're a power company to produce a megawatt of power. So how do you pay someone to not produce a megawatt of power? I mean, that is to say, how do you create a marketplace that says, I'll pay you for helping not produce megawatts, helping you not have to need the additional capacity? It's the right way to go. The market will solve the problem. But boy, it's a big mental leap because people will say, yeah, I'll put money to build that power plant over there or those photovoltaic cells or those windmills. But they see the thing they put their money into. They say, here, I'll give you money to not have a windmill, not have a gas-fired plant. It's not easy to get people's intuition around it, even though it's clearly the efficient solution. So probably a great place for entrepreneurs over the next 10 years.
Since you are in part dealing with long-term effects and our ability to predict the rapidity of climate change and the effects of climate change, do you take into account some of the more dire possibilities that are involved in the more rapid climate change that we seem to see? Our predictions always seem to be low as to what's actually happening. So do you take that into account, and if so, how?
Sure. So do we incorporate, if I could, the question, I incorporate the potential impact of climate change or, let's say, regulation in the presence of potential climate change? Absolutely. I mean, this is a dramatic impact on all the businesses we just talked about. Now, today, I think it's pretty uncertain what that impact's going to look like. That is to say, how those costs are ultimately going to be, if you will, imposed on the system. This is an externality today. That is, people produce CO2. It doesn't have a cost. If it had a cost, it would be priced into the market. Question is, what should that cost be? People are wrestling with that question today. People are wrestling with an awful lot of questions that surround the climate debate. But sure, we spend a lot of time on the question of what happens if. And our job as long-term investors, to your point, is to play out a lot of those scenarios. What happens if? Part of that gets down to portfolio construction. So part of that gets down to things like investing in all forms of energy. Part of that gets down to thinking about, well, in the relative scheme of things, where would the impacts lie? Gas, as I said, is actually a pretty efficient changeover from where we've been. 50% of the power in this country today is produced with coal. If you displace that with gas, you're clearly having a beneficial impact. Whether it's sufficient or not, a lot of scientists and a lot of economists can debate. But it's undoubtedly a favorable change. So we think about this quite a bit, and it impacts, I think, the way we ultimately look at the landscape, but it kind of gets down to scenario planning, because I don't think any of us quite know how that global market's going to play out yet.
You guys decide.
You mentioned that the unconventional gas and oil is sort of the internet of the oil and gas industry. I'm wondering, what does that mean for the companies that operate there? I mean, certainly Exxon's not going the way of borders, but are we going to see sort of these smaller independent companies become more important in the future?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and you're right. The internet analogy falls apart at some point, but perhaps not entirely, right? If we think about what the internet has meant, it has created some incredible startups, some incredible new businesses, and so has the Internet of Energy. So Chesapeake Resources is now a quite large oil and gas company, one of the largest here in the U.S., and they were quite a small company 10 years ago, and really they've emerged on the scene as the pioneer in unconventional development. Companies like EOG, XTO, quite frankly, which Exxon in turn bought. So we actually have seen it as a source of a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of new companies that, many wish I could list out that some of you will have heard of and some of you will never heard of. Some will probably become quite large companies over the next 5 and 10 years. So there probably is an analogy in the sense that there are these startups who have become big businesses from kind of an early idea. A lot of the early adopters of these various shales, remember, these have kind of happened almost in serial. We've had this Barnett Shale in Texas for a long time. And then there was the Fayetteville, and it was still pretty early, and then it kind of proliferated. And we had the Bakken Shale up in North Dakota, the kind of first big oil shale. The Eagleford down in Texas, the Marcellus in Pennsylvania. And attached to all those are entrepreneurs. In the Eagleford and the Marcellus, we backed entrepreneurs in each of them to take what amounted to land that was producing basically nothing and turn them into companies that have since been acquired by relatively meaningful global energy companies. At the same time, there's going to be adopters of the technology that are the existing incumbents, just like happened in the internet. So there's going to be the great startups, the Facebooks and the Googles, but there's going to be the adopters, right? The Walmarts managed to turn Walmart.com into a very big business. So I think you'll see actually that analogy hold. I don't mean to overextend the analogy. There are differences in capital intensity, differences probably in the role of entrepreneurs, differences in the scale of some of the incumbents and their resources. But I think the analogy probably holds more than it doesn't.
So I guess along those lines, the question I had was about, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The first, when investing in unconventional gas, there have been great uncertainties the actual size of the resource. I mean, the IEA just downgraded it 40% and 66% of Marcellus Shale. So, as an investor, how do you incorporate those sort of resource uncertainties, and also in terms of the environmental uncertainties, dealing with processed water or whatever? How do you, if you're trying to be environmental stewards, how do you try to incorporate those kind of even regulatory mechanisms into your process?
So when we think about the resource availability, that's ultimately a critical part of the judgments we make. And it's a very technical judgment for us by and large. We have engineers in-house. We hire a lot of engineering firms to help us think about, for example, the Marcellus Shale. When we participated in the Marcellus Shale, there was almost no activity there. Now, quite frankly, whether there's 200 years of supply in the Marcellus Shale or 50 wouldn't probably change our investment decision, which is we said, here's an undeveloped resource with attractive returns on capital if we can develop it. So I think, if you will, that kind of macro statistic is quite important when we think about the infrastructure we're going to build around the use of natural gas. Probably doesn't matter a tremendous amount whether there's, again, 200 years or 50 years of gas in the Marcellus for kind of an investor or entrepreneur. In terms of the impacts on the environment, so this is a really important question and topic, which is trying to get the debate back to a place where, if you will, people can get together around a table and talk about the real world impacts of fracking and development. They're real. There are real impacts on water management. There are real impacts on the surface. There are real impacts on chemical storage. And getting in a sort of intelligent conversation between regulators and industry, we're very much proponents of that. I think that's a big part of what our partnership with EDF is about, which is trying to get people around the table to find solutions. At the end of the day, that's really what our business is about, which is being a solutions provider, a partner to companies as they face problems or try to capture opportunities. So we think that's a very significant issue that needs a lot of thought. We spend a lot of time on it. And it is our hope, it's our belief, that at the end of the day, there'll be a way to optimize, to balance the impact on the environment on the one hand and the access to the resource on the other.
Okay, well, we've hit the time clock here. So could we please thank Marc, and thanks everybody for the great questions.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.